Welcome to Our Drummers Musicians, your backstage pass to Melbourne's vibrant music scene. Recorded on a cosy couch in Brunswick, join us as we explore what it truly means to be a musician, as we speak to the diverse talents that make music in our city. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Alistair Kerr, one of Australia's leading exponents of Brazilian percussion and jazz drumming. El is musical director of Panorama Brasil and has recorded and performed extensively as bandleader and sideman with jazz and Brazilian artists at the Melbourne International and Wangaratta Jazz Festivals, the Melbourne Recital Centre and Melbourne's various jazz clubs. El's academic achievements are also impressive, with an undergraduate and master's degrees in music from Canberra, a PhD from the University of Melbourne entitled A Cannibalist's Manifesto, Candomblé Rhythms for Drum Kit, and extensive study and performances in Brazil and in the USA. He is committed to education, giving masterclasses nationwide and various teaching roles, including at Monash University. Join us as we delve into El's musical journey, explore the nuance of the Brazilian 16th note feel, and discuss his passion for pandeiro. We want to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians on the land in which this podcast was recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hey El, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke.
Thanks for coming. It's so nice to see you after, quite a long time. But, you're always doing such amazing work and really have this awesome niche where you've done so much study and playing in the Brazilian and jazz scene. And so I thought it would be fun to chat to you about that and especially where did that sort of passion come from and start? Because you've played lots of different music and you're a great drummer in lots of different styles, but you have studied and predominantly play in that niche and in the Melbourne scene of that niche too.
Well, the first thing I was going to say is, after listening to that little introduction, my bio, I was like, it does its job as a bio. It makes me sound more impressive than I actually am. I mainly sit at home and play Lego and chess with my children. Oh no, it's school holidays. That's all I've done for the last 2 weeks. Yeah. So I actually got into Brazilian music through a couple of different avenues, and it was sort of like one of those gradually and all at once kind of things.
Okay.
When I was in, I guess it was year 11 and 12, I had a really great drum teacher by the name of Chris Ganinen, who, this is in Tasmania, and he lives in Victoria now. And he used to sort of come around to my house with a pile of photocopies of stuff from his studies overseas and books that he had. And he would sit down for half an hour and he would play through these pages and my jaw would drop and I would be like, drums can be like that? Wow. And then I would spend, a month or 2 months working on those sheets, and then he'd come back with another pile and I would be astonished all over again. And in those sheets were amongst those sheets were some things from, I think it was Kim Plainfield's book. Okay. Which you don't see very much of these days, but there was just some basic samba rhythms for drum kit. And it was very, sort of that Americanized kind of approach to samba, that 90s fusion-y kind of vibes. It was fine. It was just a little hook. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. And then I moved to Canberra for university, and in my first year there, just sort of acquiring CDs, back when we bought those things.
Yes.
And it was expensive and it meant something to you, and you spent a lot of time absorbing the information from every CD. Instead of just having a wash of streamed music flowing over you, you really took the time on everything because, you had $0 in the bank account, so to buy a CD that cost $30 was a big thing. So I had the Getz Gilberto record. And then I might have had a Jobim compilation, one of those Verve Jobim compilations that they put out back then, and an Ayrton Moreira compilation. Okay. This is all pretty cool stuff. And this is kind of different, and it's I like this bossa nova thing. I like this Brazilian jazz thing with Ayrton. This is all cool. I really like it. And it just sort of chugged away in the background while I was doing a jazz degree. I was probably spending more time on Max Roach, Tony Williams, all that stuff. But the Brazilian thing was ticking away in the background. And then when I got to my honours year, I needed a topic. I was like, oh, I'm going to delve into this Brazilian stuff. And I was still really into Cuban rhythms as well. I mean, I'm still into Cuban rhythms, but, you know, the Brazilian thing hadn't taken over at that point.
Okay.
And, I just got further and further into it, bought more records, got shown some more books. And I was like, okay, this is a cool little thing. It's something that I'm starting to get a bit of, I'm not going to say notoriety, but like people are noticing, oh, Al's really into that Brazilian stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. But the thing that really then kicked it off were a couple of things that happened to me in Melbourne when I moved here. First thing was I came with a list of phone numbers courtesy of Eric Ajay, the bass teacher in Canberra, wonderful teacher, incredible musician, lived in America for first half of his life and then came here. And I think the story goes, if I get this wrong, Eric, I apologise, but I think the story goes that he came to Australia to see his brother, who's a great comedian and clarinetist, and I think Eric met a lady, and I think it was all over. And, you know, all the better for Australia because he's an incredible teacher and just knows so much. And he kindly gave me this list of a few numbers of people to call. You know, you're moving to Melbourne, you don't know anybody. Here's some people, call them, drop my name, maybe something will happen. And the first person I called on that list was Carlos Ferreira, who happened to live just around the corner from me in Brunswick at the time. And so I went around to Carlos's place, and initially I was just sort of like, oh, can I come and have a lesson? I'll, you know, learn some more Brazilian stuff. This will be cool. But then I got hooked into Carlos's samba group, and, you know, for the next 2 or 3 years, played an immense amount of samba. And that sort of really hooked me in on that side of things. And that sort of just chugged away, you know, doing bits and pieces of that. I was still doing lots of jazz, contemporary jazz, and then playing with Lee Barker's group, The Sheiks. And that sort of moved into more like a trad jazz isn't quite the right word. We're like, at that stage, we're probably going deep through swing music, really.
Okay.
You know, we were all really into Ellington and some of that Wynton Marsalis stuff. And we won a Jazz Bell Award for Best Traditional Jazz Album 1 year with that group. Oh, wow. So that's sort of the space that I was working in there as well, but still had the contemporary thing with my own quartet. And after I went to Brazil for the first time, I came back with a Pandero. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd previously owned a Pandero, but American Panderos like LP, whatever brand it's going to be, Remo, etc., for a very long time, those companies did not know how to make that equipment. And they would make their Panderos way too heavy. And I remember buying my first Pandero and feeling the weight of it and thinking, how the hell does anybody get good at this? Like, I can last about a minute and I'm stuffed. Yeah, how do you get good enough to play, you know, a set of choro music on this instrument? Then I went to Brazil and realised, the ones that you use for choro are about a third of that weight.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I got a really nice little Pandero in Brazil on that trip, came back and sort of just chipped away at it. Didn't have anyone to teach me, so I'm sort of just flying blind. And even at that stage, there wasn't a heap of great instructional stuff on YouTube. YouTube was still only a couple of years old at that point, and you know, it hadn't found its feet. Not in that regard, anyway. But then I was very lucky that I met a guy, Adam May, who had lived in Brazil. I was very into Brazilian guitar, and our mutual friend Ben Carr brought Adam around for a jam one day, and we played a little bit choro, and Adam said, Al, why don't you come down to this little choro thing that we've got going on Thursday night? They had somebody else playing Pandero, but I would go along and I'd play a bit of tan-tan, which for the non-Brazilian listeners is like it's sort of like a bass drum kind of thing that you play with your hands.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's quite portable, you know, you can just shove it over your shoulder, go along, play it, you know, it's not terribly loud, it fits in a nice acoustic setting. So I'd go and play a bit of tan-tan, and then eventually the job of being Pandero player with those guys came up. And so they called me in to do a gig. And the first, I don't know, probably the first dozen gigs that I did with them, I just didn't have the chops to get through a gig.
Okay.
You know, it's a tiny little instrument. You know, it's for those of you who don't know what a Pandero is, it's, you know, it's basically the Brazilian tambourine. The jingles are shaped differently, so the sound is different. It's a much more mellow sound from the jingles. It doesn't have that bright attacking sound. and you hold it in one hand, and then you sort of rock the drum with the holding hand, and then the other hand goes through different strokes so that you get the different tones. You have like bass tones, slap tones, and then sort of just this medium in the middle kind of tone that chips away the whole time. So there's a fair bit of work in it. And for those first gigs, I would get through, 1 or 2 tunes, and then I'd basically have to take a break from Pandero because I just couldn't. I didn't have the stamina to do that thing, and it kind of just it had just been dumped in my lap in a very welcome way. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, it was. The World Cup was on at that point, and we were going to Brazilian restaurants and playing, World Cup parties. It's loud. We're doing, 3 hours. I can't hear myself. I'm fatigued. I can feel the lactic acid building up in my forearms. I'm like, oh, crikey, this is hard. And so, a couple of tunes, I'd have to pull the tan-tan out or the triangle or a shaker or something. And okay, this is my recovery time. And then do another couple of tunes on Pandero. But eventually, I built up my stamina a bit. And then sort of the big sealer there was that Monash University that year had Roberta Valenci come out as guest artist. She's a wonderful Pandero player from Sao Paulo. And she and I hung out quite a bit while she was here. And she just showed me a couple of things. And I was like, oh, the world opened up. Like a couple of just small things to do in your technique. And it all opened up. And that was probably like the final straw to just suck me completely into Brazilian stuff. I'd done lots of samba, the kind of stuff you do on jazz gigs where, we're doing some bossa novas, a bit of baião, whatever, the things that you have to learn in your Monash Tech exams to pass the bar. But yeah, it was that sort of accumulation of things that really sucked me in. And then I was doing my master's, and initially my master's proposal had been around this sort of intersection of Brazilian, Cuban, and New Orleans rhythms.
Okay.
Because there are these commonalities that come up. Yeah. Really, it's just like the African diaspora is like where these rhythms from West Africa end up and then manifest in different ways. But there's something underneath all this, and there's a lot of stuff out there that's really cool that does blend these elements together. My friend in America, Scott Kettner, he grew up sort of, like New Orleans funk and some things like that, and then got really into Brazilian music, in particular a style called maracatu, which is from the city of Recife. And Scott's got a great band called Nation Beat that blends New Orleans stuff, including like the New Orleans Mardi Gras Indians, with maracatu. And it's great, and it blends really well. And if we're going to talk about Brazilian semiquavers, I'll have to reference Scott at some point on this too, because he has a whole thing about this. I was really interested in that intersection, like how these rhythms are manifesting in different countries, and that was going to be my master's topic. And then my supervisors very sensibly said, "That's too big." I'm like, "What are you talking about? It's fine. I can manage it." No, it's just pick one thing and do one. Anyway, all the way things had gone, it was clear the Brazilian thing was what I wanted to do. I just come back from a big trip where I went through the US, Cuba, and Brazil, and it was Brazil that really hooked me in. I mean, I love those other places as well, but after a couple of weeks in Cuba, I was like, I'm ready for Brazilian music. And I put on my headphones on the plane from Cuba back to Mexico, and I was listening to some Gilberto Gil, and I was like, yeah, I think it's Brazil. Like, I love the Cuban thing. It's amazing. But the Brazil thing made my heart sing in a different way. And, that was it. And so I was like, okay, things just keep happening. Like, once you start finding that niche, people keep throwing you things that way because, like, oh, you're the guy who does that thing.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, we need a guy to play Pandero for this other thing. Oh, we'll call Al. Oh, we need a drummer to do this thing. We'll call Al. And then when I came to think about my PhD, it's like, oh, well, I'm already on this path. I might as well just research the next layer down. And so that's how I got into the Candomblé thing and researching those sacred rhythms from Afro-Brazil. And then more comes along. And I'm not complaining. I love it. I love it all. And I think career-wise, there's a real there's that thing of being first in your category. Yeah. Are you aware of this principle?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, Melbourne's got a lot of drummers, and a lot of amazing drummers. You know, I just look at, who do I work with at Monash? Well, there's Dave Beck, Tony Floyd, Danny Fisher. Okay, and there's just the three guys who I work with out there teaching drums. I go, well, okay, well, you got these other guys who are teaching at VCA, and then there are guys who are just out there playing. Darren Ferrugia, the list goes on and on. I mean, we're not going to go through a list of Melbourne drummers here, but like, I don't know. I could think, like, off the top of my head, I'm not going to do this, but off the top of my head, I reckon I could name at least 50 amazing drummers in Melbourne.
Oh, easy. Yeah.
And it's like, and I don't know everybody. I mean, my students, particularly at one of my high schools, every time they mention a name, they're like, oh, we went and saw this gig. I was like, oh yeah, I know those guys. Oh, we were in Sydney and we saw this thing. I'm like, oh yeah, I know those guys. Yeah. And they're like, do you know everybody, Al? I'm like, well, no, I don't think so. But they're convinced that I do. But yeah, like, there's so many great drummers. So, like, how do you stand? Like, I can't compete with some of those guys in the areas that they're specialists in. Yeah, like, I'm not going to match Danny Fisher for the stuff that he's really into, and I'm not going to match Darren for his, like, versatility and groove and that, beautiful. I don't want to say perfect, because I think perfect's almost insulting in a way here, but, like, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Maybe the average listener won't. Darren, I love you. You're perfect, Darren. But, like, what do I do? Well, when you find that niche and you find that you're good at it, it's like, well, exploit it. Yeah. When you're early in your musical career, there's probably not a great chance to do that necessarily, because you're still finding your way. You're finding out what are you good at, what are you really into, where are the people that you like hanging out with, all of these things. Yeah. And as I've gone on, I'm like, well, the people that I hang out with in the Brazilian music scene, I really love those guys. Like, you find your people, yeah. And it's not saying anything bad about anybody in any other niche little scene or whatever. It's just like, oh man, I found those guys and they're really cool and I like them and we hang out and it's fun. And it's very sociable. It's very like, there's a great sense of encouragement and almost like family there. And like, when you go to a Brazilian jam session, it's very encouraging. And there's often this thing of like, the older players mentoring the younger players coming through, or even not necessarily younger, but just the novice players coming through. Because you'll have people coming in who are, really keen guitarists, but they might be brand new to Brazilian music, but they're playing guitar for 20 or 30 years. Right. But, the older guitarists, the more senior guitarists will mentor those players. Oh, this is how we play this style. This is how you fit into the band. This is what your function is. So there's a very communal kind of thing there. And, the fans of the music, there's no barrier between us and them. It's not like that thing of band on a stage, audience separate, and you don't exist in the same space almost. It's like the line is much more blurred.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's a good thing. I think in Australia we too often have this thing, like, I get that it exists for a reason in certain types of music, yeah, but when you're playing jazz, when you're playing anything popular, rock, funk, whatever, Latin music, Brazilian music, the barrier between audience and performer needs to be dissolved as much as possible. As long as it's not physically unsafe, then it should be dissolved. Like, you want the audience to be right there. That energy between the two groups is really important. And yeah, so even when we have a jam session, it's like, there's that thing. It's like, everyone's there together. We're all in this together. Yeah. Whereas I'm sure you've had this experience too, where it's like jazz jams, there's much more of that cutting session vibe.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, I'm gonna show you guys how I'm the guy. Yeah. And you're trying to do something. It's almost like you're not always with malice, but like, you're trying to trip the other guy up or something. Yeah, or show off or whatever it might be. And this is not true of all jazz musicians. Don't come at me. But, I bet everyone who's a jazz musician who's going to listen to this has had that experience at a jam session. And it's not necessarily an encouraging thing. Yeah. Now, there are jam sessions where it is more like that. And you have people in Melbourne like Ronnie Farella who are so committed to that thing of encouraging and developing the younger players and, who don't have that cutting session mentality.
Yep.
Yeah, and we need more people like Ronnie. But yeah, I've ended up a long way from how I got into Brazilian music. But that's all right. I'm very good at talking.
It's great.
So if you just want to sit there, you can go and can you make me a coffee and I'll just keep chatting.
Well, yeah, there's so many different things that you spoke about that I'd want to follow up on. But maybe, when you were saying, I can do this thing and be at the top of the field in my role as a, Brazilian drum kit player. When did you start thinking like that? Was it earlier on when, as your like academic studies kept going, or was it later once you were, just playing in lots of different bands, but over time you found yourself doing more and more and then lent into it?
Well, I guess generally through most of my career, I've been happy to lean into anything. Mm-hmm. Like when I first came to Melbourne, I did lots of sort of like rock gigs, and some of it was covers, some of it was rock originals, and some sort of bluesy rock stuff and different things, and I enjoyed that. Mm-hmm. And I was still doing the samba stuff, and then other opportunities come along, and you just roll with it. And when you're a young musician and you've come to a great city like Melbourne, it's like, well, why wouldn't you be excited about all the possibilities? Mm-hmm. I don't think, obviously I've pursued it, the Brazilian thing that is, because I kept on, going to Brazil, buying the records, buying the books, talking to people, transcribing music, etc.
Yep.
At what point did I sort of realize that it was really the thing? I don't know. It probably just, at some point, I realized that almost every gig I had was Brazilian music of some kind. Mm. And so that was probably the point. I was just like, oh, well, I guess that's it. But I mean, I've still done other stuff in that time, but it's clearly dominated for 10 years or more now, and I don't feel limited by it at all. Like there's so much possibility in that music. It would be like saying, oh, well, I'm a jazz drummer, and feeling limited by that. Like, how could you possibly feel limited as a jazz drummer? It's the same for me in Brazilian music. Like, there's so much possibility there. I do gigs that might be like Brazilian jazz. Like in a couple of weeks, we're doing a thing at the Jazz Lab with Panorama Brasil, which Yael Zamir, flute player, she's been sort of a guest MD for this show, putting together music from Hermeto Pascoal and Aito Moreira.
Okay.
So looking at the Quarteto Novo and these kind of bands that those guys did. And it's Brazilian jazz. It's going to be a lot of improvisation, but then also like some highly arranged sections within it. Yep. And then, I'm working at the moment on trying to get a big project up, which is going to be Jobim material, but it'll be sort of like orchestral stuff. Okay. And it's like, well, that's going to be quite arranged and very refined, and it's going to be in a different space to that stuff, doing Hermeto and Ayrton. And then I'll go and do a Carnival gig with Danny Meyer, and she's got all this amazing energy, and we're doing samba and samba reggae, and hundreds of people are dancing, and it's completely different to the other things. Mm-hmm. Then I'll go and do a little Shoro gig playing Pandero, and it's like a different thing again. Yeah. So I don't feel limited or anything like that. I know you didn't even ask if I feel limited, but I'm just talking. So it's such a big area to work in. Like there are so many possibilities within Brazilian music that like even to call it a niche might be a bit weird. Because if I went to Brazil, they'd be like, oh well, what do you play? Yeah. Oh, I like everything. Yeah.
I'm an Australian musician. And
yeah.
Well, where do you fit into the Australian music scene?
Yeah. And yeah, look, I think it's very open, and there's so much. Part of it obviously is there's so much drumming in Brazilian music. Yep. Yeah. I guess if you're into something else, you might find, oh well, there's actually a very limited scope for drums here, but drums are so prevalent. Drums and percussion are so prevalent in Brazil. And the same with guitar. Like if you're a guitarist and you got into Brazilian music, I mean, that's like, the sky's the limit, really. I don't know if I've answered that question very well at all about knowing when it was it and when it was going to be the niche, but I just sort of followed it, and nobody told me to stop. If you find a thing and you're into it, and then it's working on all those levels. Yeah. I talk to my uni students in particular about this kind of thing, because here are kids who are trying to build towards some kind of music career. And that music career could look very different, as you know. Like some people will have this idea of like, I'm going to be a gigging muso. I know, I will just work and I'll play any gig.
Yep.
I'll do a corporate thing. I'll do a wedding. I'll do a cafe gig. I'll go and play for real estate openings or whatever it is. Yeah. Other people are like, oh no, I'm really into musical theatre. I'm going to focus on that thing. So I've got to get the skills that work for that. Some people might be thinking, oh, I'm going to have a regular job. I'm really interested in, I'm doing a double degree. I've got science or I've got law or whatever. I'm going to do this other job and then music sits on top of that. So this other thing is paying the bills and then I get to do music. So there are always different ways that it can happen. Yeah. And it's very important because we often get this sort of judgmental thing in some of the jazz schools, I think. I don't think it's as bad now as it maybe used to be, but maybe it's also just that I stamp it out with my students so quickly that I don't see it. But there can be a bit of a thing, and I'm sure you experience this too, Luke, of like sort of jazz snobbery.
Yes.
Yeah? And like, well, how many jazz jobs are there in Australia? Not many, yeah? And then you think, well, why are we putting all these kids doing jazz degrees? Well, that's not the point. The jazz thing is like, here's a standard. If you can do that thing, this is hard. If you can do it, you're showing us that you're set up to go and do anything, yeah? And I look out there and I see graduates from Monash and, wherever it is, Sydney Con, Canberra School of Music, VCA, whatever. And they're doing all kinds of different music jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be jazz. It's just like that's the thing that trained you to get to the level where you can now go and do anything. And so you got to have that sort of that correct positioning on what you're there for and what it means when you come out the other end. And not to get into that jazz snobbery kind of phase where you just like you look down your nose at somebody who's doing a corporate gig or whatever it is. Yeah. Most young musicians are disabused of that notion pretty quickly because you get out there and you're like, well, I've got to make money.
Yeah.
And this is coming back to your question. I hadn't forgotten where we started with this. Don't worry. I'm used to big loops. So I often talk to my students about this, like, well, you want to make music, yeah, because when you play music, it's something special, yeah. Well, what about you? Like, why did you go and do a music degree? Yeah, this is a legit question.
Yeah,
I mean, you may not feel comfortable answering.
No, it's fine. For me, it was like what you're saying about why do we study jazz? I wanted to take the playing of the drums to the very best level that it could. Okay. And for me, it was I love playing music with people. I want to be able to play the drums really well, so I will pursue this study of jazz theory and bebop to its highest level to then be able to apply that to being able to just make great music with the people that I love to play with.
Yeah. Now, I think there's the thing that you said, I love to play music with people. Yeah, okay. So now we're starting to get to the real foundational level. Yeah, and I mean, if we were going to go further, I'd say, well, why do you love playing music with people? Yeah. And for most of us, it's going to be like, well, it's connection. Yeah, because it feels good. We're doing a thing, we're together. Yeah, we're in training. It's like working on a job together. It's like, yeah, we did a thing, we made a thing. Yeah, and you get to share that moment with somebody. You get that connection. And then there's also this other thing. There's this little spark inside, and I don't know if maybe not everybody has this. But maybe you'll recognise some of the things I'm going to talk about. But I still remember the first drum lesson I ever went to. I'd never played drum before, but I was desperate to play drums. I played piano for a few years. My parents were very keen, like, you do piano, you get a foundation, and then we'll let you do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah, same for me, but not for very long.
Yeah, and, I stuck at piano for a surprisingly long time, considering how much I wasn't into it. I wasn't practicing much by the end, let's be honest. But, I was desperate to play drums. And so I grew up in this little country town in Tasmania. And there was a guy down the road whose parents owned a farm, and he played a bit of drums. He's quite a good drummer, Richard Sansom. Really lovely fella, nice drummer across a lot of music. And so I went down there to the house and I sat behind his kit for the first time. And I still remember the feeling of hitting that cymbal for the first time. Like he had like a Sabian AA ride cymbal. And I hit it. I was like, oh.
Wow.
And it's like you kind of spend the rest of your musical life trying to recreate that feeling. But you get to recreate it in better and better ways every time. Yeah, you're playing, music at a higher standard. You're doing more, but you're trying to recreate that feeling because there's got to be a bit of awe in it.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we have this connection with each other, but then also like this internal thing that hopefully feels amazing. And when you do it, you're like, oh, yeah, I want more of that. Yeah. So, we're after that feeling. We want the connection. We want those feelings. Yeah. And I think sometimes maybe we forget that because we work very hard to get good at a thing. I need to get good at my paradiddles. Yeah. I need to. That's a T-shirt joke. If only we had some video with it. We work on this technical stuff, and you can kind of get lost in that and forget what it's all about. Yeah, but it's so important to have that thing, that spark. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be at the highest level here, because if we only thought like that, then we block off music for the rest of the population. Yeah, like I love it when I see, a community choir or, a community drumming group or whatever it is, and everybody just gets to get in there and do that thing and make something great together.
Yeah.
And that was like when I first came to Melbourne and played with Carlos Ferreira. I'm playing with Mel Samba, just doing lots of Samba Batucada. How many musicians were in that group? Well, maybe we're all musicians. Yeah. How many professional musicians were in that group? Maybe like 2, maybe. I don't know, 3. A couple of kids who were students. Yeah. In fact, that's how I met Diego Villalta. He was like a great guitarist, but he was playing percussion with Mel Samba, 20 years ago or whatever it was. It's like, it doesn't matter that they're not professionals because we're all there and we're working on the thing and we're making it great together. You go to Brazil, you see a big samba group. They're not professionals in that way. Yeah, they're making amazing music, but they're not trying to make a living out of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a really beautiful thing. And like one of the best gigs I've done recently. It's not that recent now. It's about a year and a half ago. But João. Great friend of mine in the Brazilian scene here, he organised a concert for the 80th birthday celebration of Paulinho da Viola, who's a great sambista from Brazil. And we had Diana May Clark and her Brazilian choir there. We had some Brazilian musicians, some Australian musicians, and then a bunch of Brazilians who live in Melbourne who are sort of guest singers. And they aren't, like, most of them weren't professional singers necessarily, but they'll sing in some way. Yeah. And it was amazing. It was so good. And this was over at Cross Street in Brunswick, and the room was full, and the audience is right there, and everybody's singing along to every song, and the barrier between musician and audience was completely dissolved, and it was incredible. And I'm sitting there, and I'm looking at the faces of the people in the audience, and you can see how much it means to them, and how this is so grounded in community and our connections. As opposed to, hey, here we are on the stage doing this amazing thing, watch it and be amazed.
Yes.
It's a totally different aesthetic, but it's so much more satisfying, because the connection, I don't think I need to say anything more than that, really. It's like you've made a connection with a person, or with a lot of people, and you've all shared in the thing together. I mean, it's why do we go to the footy? It's like, well, it could be anything really. Yeah. But there's a sense of connection. You get to cheer on your team with the other fans, and like it feels good, and then you share in the despondence together as well. It's like, I'm a Carlton fan, so I've had a long time of like that.
Me too.
But now we're like, like I went to that first final last year against Sydney.
Yep.
Like felt so good. And it's like people crying at the end, like, oh my God, you know. But it's like it's the same kind of connection. It's a different manifestation of the same connection. It's like, you know, we've got this togetherness thing.
It's so interesting. I was thinking about, you know, because when you said, oh, the first thing for you remember hitting the cymbal. I don't remember the first time I hit the drums because we had a drum kit in the house as a kid. And so I grew up playing in the like contemporary church music scene. So not with professional musicians, but people that played instruments.
Yeah.
And I was really lucky to, you know, I started playing in services when I was 7, and my mum had studied orchestral percussion, and my uncle lent us a drum kit. So I got taught a couple of things, and then just, you know, experimented.
Yeah.
And most of my like initial playing was for what you're describing. You're in a community playing music with other people, and it's not about everybody listen to me do this cool thing on the drums and whatever. It's like, oh, we're just having like a community experience of playing music in the band, but also with everybody else, you know, singing along or whatever.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn drums until I went to high school and started learning off Paul Macott. And
Right.
that was awesome. And he was a great teacher. But it was very different to where I started, which is everything that you're talking about of, oh, it's in community and it's about the connection. And for me, that's what it's always been. Like, I love that, playing music with other people. And it was making me think, because, you know, a lot of the Brazilian rhythms and stuff that you do has a bit of a spiritual connection to it. And it's interesting because like studies have been a lot about putting all the parts onto the drum kit and like how to interpret them on the drum kit, but also like performance music versus like spiritual or like ceremonial music and stuff.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, like, you know, how do you like get involved with all those different things, and how's it influenced you to like what you play and do or experience it when it's, you know, coming from such like an interesting tradition and in different spots? And I know it's a little bit different, but also I want to know what your thoughts are.
Okay, how long we got? Yeah. So,
sorry, that is a huge question with lots of ways, but take it wherever you want.
And I'm thinking about our dear listeners here. So, how much do I have to unpack first? So, just very quickly, I sort of came from studying samba and bossa nova and choro and all this stuff. And then when I came to my PhD, I was like, well, I want to go deeper into the roots of this stuff. And so much of this music in Brazil has its roots in West African drumming. And how that manifested first in Brazil is really through things like Candomblé. Candomblé is a syncretic religion. Basically, it's sort of West African religious practices, then given sort of a veneer of Catholicism in order to try and maintain that cultural tradition. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was illegal in Brazil for a long, long time.
Right.
I think it was maybe the 1930s that it was made, well, legal, I guess. And so it's, you know, been an underground thing for centuries in Brazil. And there are other manifestations within Brazil. Candomblé is kind of like the big daddy of them, but there's Jurema, Macumba, etc. And it's similar to, in Cuba, we've got Santeria, yeah. But even within Candomblé, it's kind of syncretic within itself in that Candomblé mixes things from different West African peoples. So there's Bantu in there, Jeje, Angola, Ketu, etc. So even within Candomblé, there are these lots of different things happening. So, yeah, you've got these sort of two layers of it being syncretic. But all those rhythms are kind of like the foundational rhythms that then spill out to become other things in Brazilian popular culture. Yeah. So the Ijexá rhythm from Candomblé, when it manifests in popular music, is known as afuxé. So afuxé, when you listen to it, it's like really similar rhythmically. You hear the same bell pattern, same emphasis and stuff. But it's played outside in the street by, dozens or scores of drummers. Yeah. You have groups like Filhos Gigante and stuff like that parading in the streets, and it becomes a different thing. But the roots of it are Ijexá, which is inside of Candomblé. And then there are things like kabila and samba de caboclo, which you can hear is basically like samba. You take those rhythms and, just treat it in a manner in the style that we play samba, and those rhythms are it's samba. Yeah. So you can hear all this stuff in those roots. But then we also have this thing of being like the outsider. Like here I am, like just kid who grew up in country Tasmania, like going and studying Candomblé, and like, well, what do we do here? But my general experience has been so everybody from that world who I've spoken to has been very interested in me learning more about it. Like the general perception has been, it's a good thing. We want people to know about this stuff. It's great that people are talking about it and writing about this music and so forth. And I think the main thing that comes down to with all of these things is that just whatever you're doing there, it's got to be respectful. Yeah. I'm not going to name names, but there are things that we can look at in the past where we go, oh, okay, somebody's gone to a place and done a thing, and they've sort of taken this music, and then they've gone and had massive commercial success, and it hasn't benefited the people where that music came from at all.
Sure.
Yeah. I have zero commercial success. I think I got $3.46 from APRA last month. So that's out of the equation. But it's like the respectful thing is like, I went and I learned from master drummers from Candomblé. I've talked endlessly to Brazilians about this thing, and explored ways of trying to make this thing work, and finding ways to integrate it into the music that we're playing. So I started writing music that sort of drew on that tradition, but it's obviously also like it's Australian at the same time, because it's me who's writing it. So it's got these Brazilian elements from Candomblé, and then influenced by all the other stuff that I listen to and think about and have been writing. But I've had so many people, like so many Brazilians, come up to me and talk about that music that I wrote, and talking about how much it evoked for them, that thing, even though it's wow. Removed. Yeah, there are people in Brazil doing Candomblé stuff where it's much more the Candomblé influence is much more overt. Yeah, there's an orchestra, like a jazz orchestra called Orquestra Humpilés. I think I've got the name right. And they have Candomblé drummers on stage with them, and they have like these jazz arrangements, but it's like much more rooted in the tradition. Where it's obviously like part of my thing was like, okay, I'm got to move beyond that, because I'm not really of that tradition. Like I'm very interested in it. I've spent 20, 25 years studying this stuff, but it's not the same. Yeah, so all I can do is like treat it respectfully, but then I've got to kind of do my thing.
Yeah, but
that's very important anyways. Like everybody's got to find their own voice, and I don't like this idea of treating anything in music like a museum piece. Like it's got to be alive, because if it's not alive, we miss that connection thing. Yeah, and we miss the community thing, because the community thing happens when we make it in the moment. Yeah, so like being overly caught up on it's got to be exactly this, or it's not the thing. Well, we can see by looking at just the music of the past century, where we've got recorded artifacts of music, we can see just from that how much things have changed. Yeah, like if you look in Cuba, and you can take recordings over a century or so in Cuba, or you look at a century of recordings from Brazil, or a century of jazz recordings, like, well, these things have all changed, haven't they? Yeah, they haven't forgotten their roots, but they were allowed to grow and to change, and then you can revisit a thing and then grow it again, change, introduce a new thing. Oh, funk music comes along, jazz goes, we'll take a bit of that back. Yeah. We shouldn't be stuck in these things. We should respect the tradition, but not be bound by it. Yeah. And this is also true when we think about our own instruments or our lives as composers or whatever. It's like you need to know the tradition that you're part of, but there's no point recreating the past. You've got to add something new. So it's got to be your own voice in that way. But yeah, if you don't know the tradition, if you don't know the history of things, like, how do you know how to place yourself in it all? How do you know that you're not just recreating something that's already been? How do you how do you avoid misstepping and saying, hey, we've got something amazing and new, and it turns out all you did was make an exact replica of a Beatles song or whatever it is, yeah?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm always thinking about that thing of balancing that respect for the tradition and my place in relative to that music and how we then do something new with it. You know, maybe I don't always get it exactly right, but that's music, that's life, you know. It's like, I mean, who's never put a step wrong when trying to do something new?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you know, it doesn't matter, it's not specific to music. I mean, you think about like, I'm a woodworker and I'm trying something new. Well, you probably didn't nail the technique first time, yeah? How many bits of wood did you mess up before you nailed it? Yeah. But I mean, even with songwriters, like you can hear with great songwriters, you can hear them working on a thing and then eventually it's like, we nailed that thing. And then they move on, yeah? Like I think about Rufus Wainwright and there are some things in his songs that you can hear in his first couple of albums and you're like, he's working on a thing here. And then by the time you get to sort of album 3, 4, 5, like, okay, there it is. Nailed it.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah. And then you're just like, okay, move on. Leave that thing alone now. You've got that.
Yep.
But you're allowed to work on the idea, yeah. And you know, you listen to Miles Davis records, you can hear him working on a thing,
Yeah.
And you know what's spurred him on to reinvent things is probably that sense of, okay, yeah, I nailed that thing. You know, I worked on this thing with his first great quintet, and then he kept pointing out, okay, I need the new thing now. Has the second great quintet. You know, you see them working for 5 years or whatever. It's like, okay. And then it just ends. It's like, and it didn't end because they were no good no more. It's like you listen to some of those recordings from 1967 or so. It's like, wow, you know, Wayne Shorter, incredible. Tony Williams just going off. I was like, hey, moved on.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I've done that thing.
Yeah.
I feel I got it. Let's do the next thing. Yeah. And yeah, I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think other people have talked about this much better than I have, but I think you know, Joni Mitchell is probably one of the best examples of that.
Okay.
And I would highly recommend that people go and listen to Seth Godin talking about her, because he has a real nice bit about how she did this.
Okay.
And sort of like allowed her to have a career where she could do what she wanted.
Right.
And not be stuck just sort of recreating her initial success.
Okay.
Because you can get stuck in that thing where it's like, I've just got to keep doing that thing.
Of course. Yeah.
And maybe for me that would be like, I'll just keep doing this like bossa nova thing or whatever. It's like, you know, people keep on showing up for that. Okay, great. Not saying that I'll leave it behind anytime soon because I love it. But, you know, there's got to be something else going on. And yeah, I think that Joni Mitchell example is great. And yeah, Seth Godin talks very well about that subject. He has a good, nice little bit about it. I recommend people look that up.
Oh, cool. Well, I would love to just keep chatting because you have great stories and way of speaking, but I'm also acutely aware of, you know, time commitments. So I should play the games that we play at the end of my podcast.
Oh, games, okay.
And then just bring you back again to continue this discussion.
Sure thing.
So I've got this segment where we get guests to ask other guests questions. So I've got a question from my previous guest, Anne Blackburn, who plays second oboe with the MSO.
Okay.
I would like to ask them, what do they feel is the biggest challenge of living the musician's lifestyle?
The biggest challenge of living the musician's lifestyle. The simple and obvious and kind of sad answer is the financial reality of living in Melbourne now. When I first came to Melbourne, I had a share house in Brunswick, and we each paid $80 a week in rent. A little tear has just rolled down Luke's cheek. Yeah. So how do we, I mean, this is a question society-wide. How do we create the financial possibility for people to create art, especially when they're young and highly motivated and likely to actually make things that change the world? how do we encourage that so that we don't lose all our great artists to other careers because they couldn't survive?
Yes.
Because otherwise we run this big risk that music, theatre, visual arts, whatever it is, it just becomes entirely the world of rich kids. And I mean, there's a bit of that already, yeah. But like that would be an awful thing for us. Where, and this isn't to say that, poor people wouldn't make art under these conditions. Of course they do. We're driven to make art, but it's like the ability to get that art and your practice as an artist into that place where you can sustain it and keep going and keep going and keep going. Yeah. Like, how do you get through your 20s is the sort of the big question. Like, because if you can make it through that first 5 to 10 years, it's like you've probably established enough reputation, enough things that you're like, okay, I've got it worked out. I can keep this going now, you know. And, for a lot of musicians, there is that other thing, whether you're teaching or, whether you're an architect or whatever it is, you've got some other thing that pays the bills. Fine. But you can still create art. But yeah, how do we as a society encourage that and help facilitate it without just like I don't know, but like the law of unintended consequences is very real. Yeah, so I'm always skeptical of massive interventions and like massive government interventions. So often, it's a grand plan, and then like, oh, we didn't see that coming. Oh crap, yeah. So I think maybe there's actually other pathways here. And maybe it's just at sort of that university level as well, like in having better support for kids who don't have the bank of mum and dad propping them up for, university and 5 or 10 years of scratching around trying to make a living. Yeah, because I would hate to see like the jazz scene just become the world of children of rich parents. Yeah, I mean, those kids will be poor soon enough if they have a degree in jazz. But I'm allowed to be cynical. I'm old enough to be cynical now. But I that's sort of what I think. And I know that's kind of the lazy, obvious answer to Anne's question. But, that's the single biggest challenge. And I mean, I'm at a point in my career where that's not the challenge now. I've always enjoyed teaching. So my challenge is like just balancing the teaching with the performing and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. But I really love teaching. I love at high school level, university level. I have great students. I make good, I have good relationships with them, and I can see them growing and getting into it. And, you see the faces light up. You see that moment of hitting a drum and getting excited.
Yes.
And all this stuff. Yeah. And that's great. So I don't, it's not the massive concern for me. But yeah, if I were coming out of university now, I'd be thinking, oh, okay, so what am I'm going to live like 20 Ks from the middle of the town in order to have affordable rent, and all the gigs that I want to go and see and support and connect with people and go to jams and stuff. Okay, so I'm going to be in the car like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. Okay, so when am I actually going to do practice and how do I make my life easier to get these things happening? That's pretty rough now, I reckon. Because like the population of Melbourne's spreading out, but the gig centres aren't. Like, where do most of us, like if you think about the kind of gigs that we want when we're young, and we're like idealistic little jazz graduates, like I want to play Jazz Lab, I want to play Paris Cat, I want to play Uptown, etc., etc. Like, okay, so what are we looking? Like a little ring of inner suburbs and the city.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no jazz club in Broadmeadows. There's no jazz club in Melton. There's no jazz club in Pakenham that these kids are aspiring to play at.
Yeah.
But so many of us are being forced into those places. So it's like, how much of your life can you spend in a car and still create art? I don't know. I mean, like plenty of great jazz musicians have had shitty jobs. Yeah. Bob Berg, I think, was a taxi driver for a long time, wasn't he? And things like this. And it's like, well, yeah, we do it. But we're probably at a point where we're at the risk of smothering a generation of artists if we're not careful, and or a generation of artists who don't have lots of money from mum and dad to prop them up.
Yeah.
I would think that's the big challenge. Yeah.
Well, what would you like to ask our next guest?
I don't know. If I were being cheeky, I'd say, what are you going to do about the challenge of making careers work for young artists? No, I won't ask that. Well, there's a problem with a lot of these kind of things because, people are like, oh, well, what do you ask? And you get, the really asinine kind of like, oh, what advice would you give your younger self?
Which is a question that I ask everyone at the end of the episode.
Yeah, okay. Don't ask me.
Okay.
I'm really big on this. Like the Tim Ferriss thing of questions are your pickaxes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like you need good questions to get these answers that are useful. And, yeah. I wonder if a better question there instead of what would you tell your younger self is, what advice could you give your younger self that your younger self would listen to? Is there anything that your younger self would have listened to? Yeah, because so many of us went in there at that point. It's like, I wouldn't listen to that advice. That's just some old codger talking. Get out of here. Yeah.
All right, I like it. I will adopt that in.
Yeah, but feel free to ask everybody else. I don't care. Yeah, I don't know. I sometimes wonder about weird things. Because there's like a lot of horrible stuff happens in the world, and like small tragedies all the time, as well as big tragedies. But like sometimes the small tragedy can hit home harder. But I often think, okay, well, music and for me, like when I was at university, I had an accident where I lost the tip of a finger, and it's like you get that sort of shock when you have an injury like that. You go into shock, but then at some point the shock thing wears off, and you hit the oh crap moment, and you just have that like thing. What will I do? And so here's a deep and awful question for the next guest. I assume they're going to be a musician.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a variation on the if you couldn't do music, what would you do? But the question is, if you couldn't do music, how would you survive psychologically? I don't think I could.
No,
I would
me
really
neither.
struggle.
Yeah.
I would really struggle. And I would look for any way to do it. And if like something happened, I don't know, say some illness or injury prevented me from playing drums, I would be looking for something else to do. I would join a community choir and sing. I would do something. Yeah, I would be desperate to find another way to do it.
Yeah.
Because again, there's like that little drive, that connection, the spark, the community, the connections, all those things. But yeah, I do wonder about these things because like I don't have anything else to do as a job. I mean, I'll be stuffed. I wouldn't be able to make money. I'll be a motivational speaker. What are you going to do when they chop your hands off?
Yeah.
Get motivated, kids.
Well, you got very strong arms, so maybe a bricklayer or something.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
keep the Popeye forearms
I'll
going.
take it. I do like to be outside. I mean, it's not really nature. But
You could stack them in time.
yeah, I'll just stack it. I'll stack bricks in time.
Polyrhythms between your hands.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay. No, you're selling quite well now. Actually, great. I can see the t-shirts already.
Well, all right. 5 questions then to wrap up.
Okay, let's go.
Quick fire.
Oh, no, I don't do quick fire. God, you sat through the last hour. You know I'm not doing quick fire.
What's your favourite venue to play in Melbourne?
Favorite venue to play in Melbourne? Any venue where the people are into it and the connection can be allowed to exist.
what's your dream venue to play at?
Maybe the Melbourne Recital Centre, because I really like the vibe there.
But you've played there. It's not a dream venue.
Yeah, no, but that's like to be able to do the thing that I want to do there. How's that? Because I don't think there's anywhere like I think about those venues. Like I don't think it's anywhere better than that, or beautiful little theatres. Like I like theatres of that size. So any beautiful theatre of that size, sort of 1,000 seats, 1,500 seats, that's my dream. I love those places.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
All right, what's your coffee order?
It's either an espresso or a long black.
What's your favourite place to get food after a gig?
Oh, I'm very funny with food, so I don't have that anymore. In the old days, it was Agadir up on Sydney Road.
Oh.
Yeah, just sort of like dirty kebab style, but Iraqi. Thick bread, spongy, soaks up the sauce.
Yep.
It's really good, but I don't eat bread anymore, so my kebab days are gone. Sadness.
All right, and what's one piece of advice that your younger self would have listened to if you could give it to them now?
I don't know. Trust the thing that you did when you were getting better and keep on doing it and don't stop.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for doing the podcast with me, Al.
Real pleasure, Luke.
It's been great. If anyone wants to get in contact with you to like hear your music, see you play gigs, ask you for lessons or book you for sessions, what's the best way for them to get into contact with you?
Probably via my website, alistairkerr.com.au. Though I don't know if you can get in contact with me via there at the moment, but I'm working on things. But you can find me. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and stuff. I don't check these things regularly, but I'll see a message.
Perfect.
I just come and say hello at a gig. That's the best thing. I love it when people come up and say hello. And I promise to talk to you less than I have now.
No, that's awesome. Thanks so much, Al. I really appreciate it.
Cheers, Luke.
Thanks for joining us on Our Drummers Musicians. I hope you enjoyed getting to know another Melbourne muso like I did. Help us grow by leaving a review, share the podcast with friends and family, and subscribe on our website for extra info. Got a guest you'd love to hear on the show? Please let us know at ourdrummersmusicians.com. See you next time.